We are going to start with the Exodus and the conquest. I know this is a little off-center. There aren't perfect right angles. Are you guys okay with that? Where we live? All right, good. Right. Before we even get into the Exodus, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Egypt. And my, oh man, come on, here we go. I want to talk a little bit about Egypt, and part of the reason I want to talk about Egypt is just because that's where the Israelites were. And they were there for 400 years. So even though I don't necessarily have a ton of time to devote to talking about Egyptian culture or Egyptian religion, I think it's worth at least just kind of having a rough idea of what was going on in Egypt. So to start out with, if we're just looking at this map, one of the things that I think we should point out here is that this is Egypt around the time of Israel's enslavement and Exodus. Now, just to be really upfront, like we don't know the exact date of the Exodus. There's a lot of debate over that I can't dive into for the moment. So we're just going to set that aside and just take note of some of the things that are going on at this time. So over here we have Assyria. Now Assyria later on will be a huge empire, but right now they're not that big, relatively small. Over here you've got the Hittite kingdom. So they're really the big daddies on the block up here. Okay, they're really strong. Down here you got Egypt, and in the middle here you've got this contested land with these green stripes. And basically, what's happening here is that this area is claimed by Egypt, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have like a ton of strong governmental control over that area. But it is important to know that they claim it. That'll come up later. See, this happened before, where there was like a delay. Okay. Looking at Egyptian culture, I think it's important to recognize that the fact of Israel's enslavement may not have been the only concern for the Hebrew people there. Egypt's culture was very different from the monotheism that you get in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if you remember, they're here for 400 years. That's just a really long time. So there's no guarantee that these Israelites are worshiping Yahweh. There's no guarantee that they really understand their ancestry in deep ways. Now they may have, we don't really know. The Bible doesn't necessarily say a lot one way or the other on that subject. But I just think it's important to know that they have been enmeshed in this culture for a long time. So they're going to absorb quite a bit of it. And for that reason, I think it's helpful to just look at a couple of things. The Egyptians are pantheistic, like pretty much everybody else, but they're kind of unique in that they have, their main god is Ra, or sometimes you see it as Re when you do the reading. But he enters the universe through self-creation. He's a sun god. You can see in this picture, he's got the sun up there on his head. All right? And when he self-creates, basically, he seizes control of 8 pre-existing gods of chaos, and he brings order to those gods, or he kind of harmonizes them a little bit. And then because the sun, as like an object of nature, was their main god, what they did is they looked at the sun and they saw that it crossed the sky every day and then went down. And so what they believed that the sun was going down into the underworld and kind of dying and then being reborn each day in this kind of cyclical pattern. And so for the Egyptians, time is a little bit more cyclical than it is linear. Now, I don't mean this to be like a hard generalization. Certainly the Egyptians did believe in like yesterday and tomorrow. And this happened a few days ago or whatever. I'm sure they believed in those things. But the way they kind of conceptualized time had more to do with like a rhythm of life. And that gets connected to nature and even human life. So like when you think about nature, we have 4 really distinct seasons here. Now the Egyptians wouldn't have like a winter in the way that we do and some of those things, but they would have had seasons in the same way. They would have had like a rainy season, or they would have a time where it would flood, or a time when it's dry. And those things are somewhat predictable, and so they can live their lives knowing that these cycles will keep coming through all the time. And so that cyclical nature of time, or the fact that time kind of repeats itself in an orderly way, points to this Egyptian idea called Ma'at. And Ma'at is like the harmony and order of nature. Okay, and so when we think about Pharaoh, his main job is to kind of maintain or keep Ma'at in the kingdom, to keep harmony, to keep order. So when we think about the Pharaoh, and really when we think about other ancient Near Eastern kings, they're kind of unique in the way that we think. They're not like elected officials. Okay, normally they gain power through family, right? So they have a monarchy, but they also have power that kind of comes from the gods. Like every pharaoh would have been seen. I don't know if this is quite the right way to put it because I'm not like an Egyptologist or anything, but like seen almost as an extension of Ra. Okay, as like not even just Ra's ambassador, but he's truly like doing Ra's work of harmony. So when you think about these ideas, in my mind, these ideas are very, very different from what we get in Genesis. And this thing is having a delay, so I'm kind of frustrated here. Oh, nope. These are very, very different from what we get of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, we don't view God in connection with the Son. Okay, God isn't the Son. He's spirit. We don't think about order and Ma'at as being super important. When you think about the person of Moses, Moses is God's ambassador or his prophet, but he's not connected to God quite in the same way that the Pharaoh would have been connected to the idea of Ra. So when they move out into the desert, when they leave Egypt, it is about them leaving some of this other stuff, this polytheism, this kind of vision of time, this understanding of who God is and what God wants from them. Those things are going to be kind of new to them, or at least partially new. So let's dive in a little bit. Do we know the exact Exodus route? Short answer, no. Can I just quit this section? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we don't know. There's a few different reasons why. I'll go ahead and list some of them, but really I want to list this to help us understand that when I look at this, when I go through the traditional route that I'm going to go through, it's mainly kind of like something for me to hook my imagination onto. But in the back of my mind, I have to remember that we don't totally know. So we do not know the exact locations of many of the places mentioned in the Exodus, okay? We just don't know them, and there's some reasons why many of the sites now have Arabic names. Okay, so if you go over to the Sinai Peninsula now, or you go over to Egypt, they have all these Arabic names. They didn't have those names then. Okay, so when you think about the Mediterranean world in particular, the Mediterranean world has changed political hands over and over and over and over again throughout history. And as it's done that, it's changed languages quite a bunch. And usually when you have a new conquering power, they do a lot of renaming. They give the city a new name, or they give the location a new name. So sometimes it's hard for us to figure out based on what like an Arabic name is now. Does it correspond with the biblical name? We don't have really physical evidence of the Exodus route. And part of that is just related to the fact that we haven't done much archaeological work on the Sinai Peninsula, broadly speaking. I don't really know why that is. I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm not super up to date on like who's offering archaeological grants and things like that. But basically, we just haven't done a ton of work, so we don't have a ton of direct archaeological evidence. And beyond that, scholars just disagree. Okay, so and that comes partly from the biblical text, and that comes partly from this lack of knowledge. Okay, hold on. I'm having trouble moving through the slideshow, which is very frustrating. Oh, well, no, okay. So let's look at the traditional route. So the traditional route, if we start off with our point of departure, it's Ramses. We see this in a couple of points in Exodus, but I'll just use the one in the first chapter, verse 11. So they put slave masters over them, that is the Israelites, to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So this is kind of like their primary job. It doesn't mean it's their only job. It doesn't mean it's the only thing that they would have done, but this is kind of primarily where it seems to be that they're located. And these names get brought up again when they actually do get delivered and when they actually get ready to leave. So later on in Exodus, you see those again. Here's a big map. I just kind of enlarged that a little bit for you to see. If you'll notice, Ramses is up here with this giant, red circle around it. Ramses is in the northeastern part of the Nile Delta. This is a pretty good spot for them to start out from, because if you think about Egypt as a kingdom that basically just exists, it's the Nile River. There's Memphis here, way down here toward this drywall is Thebes and Luxor and some places like that. So if the Israelites had been in those places, they might have had a little bit more of a difficult time. Whereas located in Ramses, they have a pretty easy access into the Sinai Peninsula and possibly into Canaan. So the second stop, I won't really belabor this point, is Succoth. I'm probably mispronouncing that. You can see it spelled with a C or a K there. But they go from Ramses to Succoth here. You can see that line coming down. And then what I want to do is I want to bring up something that I always, like whenever I read Exodus, I find this a little funny. I don't know if I should. Maybe I shouldn't find it funny. I don't know. Exodus 13:7. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. And part of why I find this funny is that this whole idea, okay, no one else is laughing. I'm laughing on the inside. Okay? But part of why I find it funny is that really when you read Exodus and you read Numbers, this idea of them wanting to go back to Israel recurs over and over and over again. Like every time they hit, not every time, but they hit a hardship and it's like, you know, God's leaving us to die in this desert. It would have been better if we'd stay in Egypt. Why don't we go back? So this is their constant thing, and God seems to be predicting that right off the bat. Like, he doesn't want to put them, though, in a position of war. And I think there's actually some good practical reasons for that up front, but we'll get to those in a minute. For now, what I want to do is, I don't know why, there's a delay in the slideshow now for some reason. So, that is true. But it's a delay in the actual, like, when I hit it. So the clicker's working. But here we go. So what I want to do is I want to look at what that route might have been. As you can see on this map, you've got the way of the land of the Philistines. So what they could have done, hypothetically, is come out of Ramses, hit this road right here, and just follow it all along the Mediterranean coast, basically, and up into Canaan. That would have been pretty easy. It would have been shorter. But their problem was that this is where the Philistines were. And so if they had done that, they would have ran smack dab into the Philistines, and they wouldn't have been prepared for war. Remember, this is a nation that is just coming out of slavery. Like they're not a nation in the sense of like they're not organized. They don't have they wouldn't have proper weaponry necessarily. So they would have been totally unprepared for war. So I think God's decision, it seems odd in the sense that like, oh man, it would have been nice to go straight through, and you know maybe God could have just like destroyed the Philistines. But it does make sense for them to kind of go down here and avoid all that stuff. Let me see. If I actually touch the button, will it work faster? Nope. That probably just made it go 2 slides forward. And now I have to go. Yep, there we go. So then we have the journey to Mount Sinai. So now that they're in Succoth, and we're going to stick with that traditional route. I do want to point out here there is an alternate route that would take them up this way and over this kind of like land bridgey type thing, and now to here, a proposed location for Mount Sinai. So when we look at this, we're going to see something like Jebel Halal. That's the name, that's the Arabic name of this mountain here. And Jebel just means mountain, so it's like saying Mount Halal. This route, even though it's an alternate route, I don't really buy into it a whole lot. Mainly because it doesn't seem like it would account for the Red Sea very well. So as you look at this line right here, it's not really strictly a border per se. Today, if you go to this area of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, you'll find the Suez Canal, which leads up here and connects the Mediterranean Sea all the way down into the Indian Ocean, essentially. But at the time of the Exodus in Egypt, they had a canal there too. We have evidence of that canal. And so basically what it was meant for, it was meant to keep slaves inside Egypt, and it was meant to keep invaders out. But I just don't think that canal necessarily makes a good location for the Red Sea. Anyway, they come down here in 1523 and they go to Mara. Now, Mara, as you notice, has a question mark around it, so we just don't know. Maybe that's where it is, maybe not. They couldn't drink its water because it was bitter. In 1527, then, they come down to Elim. Elim is right here. Again, we have another question mark, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near the water. So one of the things I think is interesting is that these lakes right here are actually bitter lakes. Even now, they have high salinity. So I don't know if Mara could maybe somehow be connected to up here. It's just, it gets a little bit kind of confusing. But there are some facts that point to the traditional route. And if my clicker will let me go back and forth, this will be kind of fun to look at. But the route along the eastern shore of the Gulf of Suez was a well-known route for mining. So when you look at this right here, you'll notice right here, this map has the Serabit mines. Okay, so this was a mining area for Egypt. And if you remember the economy of Egypt slide that I had last week, they had a bunch of gold way down here on the Nile River, but they also had some gold in this area, and they also had a bunch of other metals and things, minerals that they would mine in this area too. So Egypt, even though they didn't necessarily they claimed this land, they didn't have a lot of governmental control, but they could use it. It's not highly populated. Nobody's really kind of down here, so they would have been mining that area. As such, some Israelites may have worked in these mines and would possibly know the route firsthand. Now, that's totally speculative. And obviously, they do have like a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, so I'm assuming they don't need an Israelite to tell them which way to go. But now, if somebody did know that route, they might be able to know, like, I don't know, different little nooks and crannies of the route, where to get this, where to get that type of thing, a good place to go to the bathroom. I don't know. But they could have had somebody like that. But the real kicker for me that I think is interesting is that this route would have been used seasonally in January and March, and they would have been less likely to face inevitable conflict with the Egyptians. If you guys remember, we noted that last week when we were just kind of looking at the calendar, the Jewish calendar, we noticed that they left Egypt in March, April, okay, the month of Aviv. So if they're leaving in March, April, that means they're leaving after the seasonal mining is done. So it's not very likely that they'll actually encounter resistance along that route from any of the Egyptians. So they'd have kind of a free pass, so to speak. And now I'm just waiting for the slide to come. Here we go. This is just a close-up slide. Basically, looking at this again, we don't really need to see it again. I'm going to go forward here. I wanted to look at Mount Sinai. Now, here's another thing. We don't know exactly where Sinai is. We do have a traditional location, and that's what you're looking at here, Jebel Musa. So that's a picture of it. And what I think is interesting about the traditional location here, you can't see the writing very well, it's just kind of blurry. But here is where Mount Sinai would be. And what I like about this location is that you can see right here, there's a big kind of flat area that Israel could have camped in. And they would have been pretty close to Mount Sinai, and Moses could have walked up this little valley. It would have been a nice, relatively easy climb. Okay? So that's our traditional Mount Sinai. And then I found this map, which I thought was really helpful, where it shows us some other possible locations. Now, this is one of those things where I'm just kind of like showing you this for fun. If somebody wants to debate me over the location of Mount Sinai, I'm just going to say like, okay, you win. You know, if you're really into this, you win. But here's Jebel Musa. And remember, Jebel means mountain. Musa means Moses in Arabic, so mountain of Moses. But here's Ras Safsaf. Okay, I can't pronounce that very well. And that's right over here, a little bit to the northwest of the traditional Mount Sinai. So it's kind of a little majestic, a little more majestic than Mount Sinai, in my opinion, or the traditional one is. Oh, now we got a delay again. Here we come. I think these are kind of fun to look at just because when I look at like the traditional Mount Sinai, it's not like a big, like towering mountain in my mind, and that's how my imagination had always pictured it. Here is Jebel Serbal. So Jebel Serbal is back here a little bit, a little further away. That's one location that some people have pointed to. And then finally, Jebel Katarina, which is close, it's just to the southwest of Jebel Musa. This is a winter picture, so that looks pretty, powerful, strong mountain. But any of those could do. Now I want to pick up with Exodus 19:1. So here's what I think is really interesting about the Pentateuch in general. Let me take a sip of coffee. Is that if you start reading the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis starts off with these sweeping big world stories. You get these really exciting narrative stories about the patriarchs. When you hit Exodus, they're in Egypt. You got the story of Moses being put in a basket of reeds. You've got, Moses murdering somebody and fleeing and coming back, and having he meets God at the burning bush, and he comes back, and he has this kind of like duel with Pharaoh where you've got 10 plagues, and they cross the Red Sea, and they're wandering. It's super eventful. And then what happens in chapter 19, the narrative just kind of like stops, really stops hard. And you just get a lot of laws, a lot of worship instructions, and things like that. But what I want to point out here is that on the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. So this is the 3rd month after they left. So they've been on the road for 3 months. That's about how long it took them to get to Mount Sinai. And I think if you just had a couple of people, that might have been a quick trip. But you got a whole nation. Estimates on the size of Israel vary, but I've heard anywhere from like 1 million to 1.5 million people. I don't remember. I've looked at the census before, and I didn't calculate that up this time. But it is a lot of people when you include all men, women, and children, etc. So now they're kind of in the wilderness, and they're going to be on the move again. So chapter 19, they stop. They get the 10 Commandments, they get the law of the covenant, they receive instructions on the tabernacle and that sort of thing. And then the narrative picks up again here in 33, 1 through 3. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised you, and oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants, etc. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey." So in my mind, what would happen at this point is we would see them get up and leave. Well, that's not what we get. What we get is we get them building the tabernacle, and that kind of lasts for most of the rest of Exodus. And then we get the entire book of Leviticus, which we all know is ceremonial laws, sacrificial laws, code laws for how to run the nation, different things like that. So Leviticus is just all laws. Then you get into Numbers, and once you hit Numbers, the first large section of Numbers is just census information. Okay, so information of how big Israel was. So there's this huge gap. I'm going to press this button again. Man, I'm really frustrated with this delay thing. I don't know why it's doing that. I should have recorded the first section here. So what they're going to have to do then is just go straight up here, all the way up to Canaan. So if we talk about that short route again, that would have been so nice, but they took really the longest possible route that you could take. They're going to go all the way down to the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, and they come all the way back up again. Once you get to Numbers 10, then they're on the move. On the 20th day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year, the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle of the covenant law. Then the Israelites set out from the desert of Sinai and traveled from place to place until the cloud came to rest in the desert of Paran. So this is early June, about when they're leaving. And so they've been there about a year. And that's a long time. So they've been just camped at Sinai for about 1 year. Why the gap? So on a narrative level, we see basically there appears to be a gap of almost 1 year. Why did I write that? Okay. Biblically, it covers Exodus 33 to Numbers 10. I've already said all this stuff. I just must have went really far ahead in my brain. I'm sorry about that. Disregard this slide. Okay, what were they doing? And this is a big question that we can be a little bit speculative on, but this is kind of why I think they shouldn't have gone that short route. During this time, we aren't 100% sure because the Bible just doesn't say a lot directly. It doesn't give us stories or say, during this year they did X, Y, and Z. Basically, but what I think they probably did is they learned their new law, so they've been receiving the law. Okay, so they're learning how to implement that. They're learning about their new worship practices, okay, because this is all new for them. They've been in Egypt for a long time. And they're going to grow as a nation So what I mean here is that if you think about them as a group of slaves who've just been in Egypt for a long time under Egyptian rule, they now have to figure out how to organize themselves as a nation. They have to figure out what it means for them to take care of themselves, to be outside of the structures of Egyptian government and slavery. So they just need time to do that. So I think when I say grow, I don't necessarily mean grow in size. I just mean grow in kind of like almost comfort with being a nation. And the other thing they do is they eat a bunch of manna. Okay? They do that a lot. And that actually kind of feeds into what happens to them next. See, if I hit the slide button really fast, it'll move really fast. But if I stay on a slide for like a minute, it won't do that. Okay, so then we're going to look at a possible route to Kadesh Barnea. So they start out here in Ramses. Their next big stop is Mount Sinai, and then their next big stop really is going to be Kadesh Barnea. And that route is going to take them north. Between Sinai and Hazeroth, which is right here, there's a question mark by this again because we don't necessarily know where Hazeroth is, but between that area, they complain about food. Okay, so they've been eating manna for a while. They've been eating it for like a year. So they complain about it. They don't like that. God says, okay, cool, I'll give you some meat. And he sends in all this quail from the Red Sea. And Numbers says that they get 3 feet of quail, which is like, what, this tall on me? I really hope that's hyperbole. Because if it's not, it's kind of gross. And if it's not, it's not. Then they don't like that, so then God sends a plague on them. So they get out of Sinai after a year, and they do not start off on the right foot, in my opinion. They're just kind of struggling here. Okay, I'm really sorry about this. I don't know why there's this delay. I pressed the button. Okay, so the other story that we get is after that, the people left Hazeroth and they encamped in the desert of Paran in Numbers 12. You also get this story where Moses' brother Aaron and his sister Miriam kind of gang up on him. They're upset that he's getting all the attention and the spotlight, and God really quells that. Again, I'm not necessarily going to go into that story deeply, but I just want to point out that in these sections of Numbers, there's just not necessarily a lot happening. Like, we don't know a lot of what happened between Sinai and Kadesh Barnea. I hit the button. I promise I hit the button. Okay, this is Numbers 33. I'm not actually going to spend a lot of time on this. If you get to Numbers 33, what you're going to get a list of is all the places that they went to on their journey. In fact, I got 2 slides full of that. I'm not going to read all of those. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this, however, is that I found out, at least according to one of the atlases that I was looking at, that there's 51 unique place names in Numbers 33, and of those 51, we only know with certainty where about 10 of those are. So the rest of them we have a lot of questions surrounding. And so I think it's just helpful to kind of have that in the back of our mind. So if you want to read all those, you can go to Numbers 33. I'm going to move on. Then we're going to look at the expedition into Canaan. Now, what I want to do with this slide is I just want to really illustrate something. You guys will be familiar with this probably. In Numbers 13, they send the spies into Israel. Starting with verse 21, so they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob. So here's the desert of Zin down here, and Rehob is right there, up at the top. And they go toward Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman and Shashi and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. So one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this map up is because, for me at least as an early Bible reader, when I looked at this, I didn't really necessarily have a huge concept of where exactly they'd gone, because I didn't know where Rehob was or Lebo Hamath. But what I want to illustrate is that they really do get the whole length of the Promised Land. They go through it up and down all the way. They're getting all these territories. They don't apparently go over to the coast a whole lot, but they're going to look at the hill country. They're going to see all this area. They're going to see Galilee. They're going to see the area to the north. They're going to get pretty far up there. So they're doing a good job of looking at everything. Okay, and then basically what happens is they're going to come back down. When we get to Numbers 13:23, when they reach the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. Two of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. And I just thought it'd be good to illustrate, here's where the valley of Eshcol is, right there above Hebron. So they would have carried those grapes and pomegranates and figs back with them to Kadesh Barnea from that area. Now, the goals of this expedition were twofold. One, they were going to determine the military strength of Canaan. So they need to look through all these cities along the way, and they need to ask, well, like how big is Beersheba? How many people are there? How well is it fortified? They're going to do that with all these cities going all the way up here. And then they want to determine the economic resources. So they want to figure out, can we farm this land? Like, is there food? Is there plenty to eat and drink and everything? And so what happens is the spies all agree on number 2. It's economically viable. We can go there. It truly is a land flowing with milk and honey. It's rich and fertile. It's great. But only 2 of the 12 agreed that the land could be taken. Okay? And you guys might know that that's Joshua and Caleb. But I want to actually just throw a bone to those other 10 just for a moment. Now, obviously, they didn't have faith in God and they weren't obedient, but they also weren't crazy. The archaeological evidence from the late Bronze Age, which would have been around this period, confirms that Canaan was heavily fortified. It confirms that these cities were pretty strong. An example is going to be Hazor. So if I go back here, Hazor is right up there, just above the Sea of Galilee. But an example might be Hazor. It appears to have had an upper city of 26 acres and a lower city of 160 acres and a population of around 40,000 people. So that's roughly a quarter of a square mile, which is not very big to stick 40,000 people in. So this is super dense, super well fortified. It's not an area that you're probably going to take very easily. And I thought this would be fun. This is just like a little personal detour, okay? This is the neighborhood that I used to live in, Albany Park. Roughly 2 square miles, had 52,000 people in it. So that's really, really big. That's like 2 Lockports, okay, in this area right here. And that's the densest place that I've ever been. I can't imagine like cutting this neighborhood into this much and sticking 40,000 people right there. So that's kind of a big deal. And if you want to know, this is right here is where we live. So, okay, that's a little detour for you. So basically what happens is those 10 spies say, no, we can't go in there. It's too fortified. The rest of Israel kind of agrees. God says, okay, then you can't go in. All right? You all are going to die, and I'm going to let your children go in. And then a group of them kind of say, oh, no, let's go in. Let's do this. And God says, no, don't do that, because I'm not going to be with you. And Moses tells them that. But nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the highest point in the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah, which we think is right here. And Hormah means devoted to destruction. So they kind of got their butts kicked. Okay? But one of the things I liked about this map, and one of the reasons I chose to include it, is that this is just really simple. If you guys remember the maps that we looked at last week, like where is the hill country? Well, what this does is this tells you, nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the highest point of the hill country. And that's all it says. Well, at least this gives me an idea of where the hill country is. All right, now I actually did try to go onto a rabbit trail to figure out exactly what the highest point is. I couldn't figure it out, but they had got it right about here. So that's all I got for you on that. Okay, you're going to have to wait for the delay. Apparently I talked a little too long on that slide. Okay, so now we're going to encounter my favorite map, or the favorite place that I found a map. The source of this map is the Primitive Baptist Digital Library. Okay. Basically, what I wanted to show is, again, just that once you get past that failed attempt at going into the land. There's not a whole lot that happens. Number 16, 17, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, they rebel. That gets kind of quashed. Nothing else really much happens between the conquest and return to Kadesh. There's not a whole lot else that happens. So basically what I love about this map is that it just has a simple illustration of kind of the steps. Now, I would actually tweak this map a little bit. But step one, here you got them coming in from Egypt. They're going down to Sinai. They've got step one ending at Hazeroth, which that doesn't make sense to me. But I like it stopping at Sinai. Then step number 2 has them going back up to Kadesh Barnea. 2B has them getting their butts kicked here. 3 is just a circle. Because we don't really necessarily know a whole lot about what happened during those years between their first attempt at going in and when they return and are able to actually affect the conquest of Israel. But when they do, they kind of come up this way and go in and do all this stuff. So that's really why, like after the book of Numbers, what you get is Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy doesn't really have a whole lot of narrative. It's basically, as far as I understand it, a series of sermons by Moses. And so really the narrative just kind of cuts into when they're going to go into Kadesh Barnea for real. We don't have a lot of knowledge about those wilderness times. So let me wait for this next slide to come up. I really apologize. I wish. Okay, let's try that again. So now we're actually going to go into Kadesh Barnea again, and we're going to start and we're going to conquer that land. So there is a traditional route of the conquest of Canaan. I tend to favor this myself, but basically you go from Kadesh to Edom. They send these messengers over to Edom, and they basically say, hey, look, we'd like to go through your land. We don't want to fight you. We don't want to do anything. We just want to walk through your land because we got somewhere else we want to go. And they say, no. Okay. So then Israel goes to Mount Hor, which we think is right about there. I didn't like this map because it was kind of confusing about like exactly when and where people are going different places. But after that, they head toward the Red Sea. Down here on the way, that's where we have the bronze snake incident. Okay, where people are sick and Moses brings up a bronze snake and they're able to look at it and get healed. But then eventually what they're going to do is they're going to come down here, and instead of going in through Edom, they're going to cut around Edom and Moab. Now, one of the things that is important to know is that for them, wanting to cut through Edom, the reason they would want to is because there's this thing called the King's Highway. This was a pretty natural route that had been established, so it would have been much quicker and easier for them to go through that and then come up into this direction. All right. But Edom said no. So, and I do want to point out too that right here, like we got Moab and Edom who are pretty established as kingdoms, and Ammon right here. Now this has some kings in it, but it's not quite as established, so it's a little bit easier to cut into. And we see in Numbers 21 that they're going to defeat these kings, Sihon and Og. Okay, so even before they enter into Canaan proper, which is right here, Israel is going to take a large swath of land in the Transjordan. Okay, remember the Transjordan is just the land beyond the Jordan. So Israel settled in the land of the Amorites. They struck him, that is Og, down together with his sons and his whole army, leaving them no survivors, and they took possession of his land. So as you can see right here, again, after they've circumnavigated Moab and Edom, they come up around this way. They're going to have a battle right here as the forces of King Sihon come down. They're going to defeat them. They're going to move in here. Then they're going to settle here a little bit and have this be their base camp. And then they have some battle missions that go up here, and this is where they defeat King Og, who comes down here. All right. So even before they get into the Promised Land, they get to kind of do a little bit of conquering there. All right. Here's a little map that I think is helpful in terms of just knowing the journey of the spies. So Israel's here camped out at Shittim, and they're going to send their spies in here across the Jordan River. They're going to go to Jericho. This is where they meet Rahab and everything, and then they have to flee. So they kind of flee and they go this way and they check out this area too, and then they're able to come back. All right, that's not super exciting, but I just thought it was worth showing to you guys. Oh, come on. I didn't stay on that slide for very long. All right. So when did they cross? So basically what you're going to do is once you get to Joshua chapter 4, verse 19, you'll read this: on the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. So here's Gilgal right here. So they're going to camp there. And I want to point out that when they use this, the 10th day of the first month, they're not using the Jewish calendar proper here. What they're doing is they're basing the first month off of like the first month of their deliverance from Egypt. So this is happening at the same time of the year as their deliverance from Egypt. So these two things correspond: deliverance and conquering the land of Canaan, or beginning to conquer it. I don't necessarily have like a ton of time to go into Jericho. Jericho is kind of a controversial bit of archaeology. Where it is, what it is, all that type of stuff. There's basically just a lot of debate around it. But this is the traditional side of Jericho, and you can see the remains here are kind of high up. So it was a city that had risen up a little bit, if this is the correct site. And you can just see these two different angles of the site there. And there's been a lot of archaeology there. But here is Jericho, just like a map I was able to scan out of one of my books here. And now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in and no one came out. Right? I said that, yeah. They were prepared for Israel. They knew Israel was going to come, so they were ready for them. As you can see here, the city of Jericho, according to archaeology anyway, has these two rings. So here's the outer wall, here's the inner wall. We found a round tower in that traditional site. We see different residential areas and things like that. But one of the problems with Jericho, if the traditional site is correct, and again, there's debate about that, but if it's correct, Jericho was probably abandoned when Joshua and his armies came through, but then it was also resettled quite a bit later. So that kind of can confuse the archaeology a little bit to some degree. But let's look briefly at the southern campaign. Now, this is the thing where I feel like I'm just kind of skimming the surface of what we can do with this type of stuff. And that's mostly just because I kind of want to illustrate in broad strokes what was happening geographically. But you can see that they had camped out at Gilgal, they captured Jericho, they come over here. There's a whole thing about Ai as well. They come over here, they've got Gibeon, they come down this way, and they start capturing all these different cities here, and they're fighting the Amorites, and they're kind of like just kind of going in through that area. What's really nice, in my opinion, about the way that they enter into Israel is that this base offers them access both to the south and then to the north. If they'd camped down there in the Negev or Beersheba or somewhere like that, they could have conquered this, but then they would have to kind of like keep moving their camp upward and upward. Otherwise, they'd have to keep going back and forth on this land. Whereas by having their camp here, it allows them easy access both north and south. Okay, I clicked the button and it's not ready to go yet. But basically, the next map is going to be the northern kingdom, or the northern campaign, I'm sorry. And it's going to show you the same thing. It's not terribly exciting, but what you can see is you've got these Canaanite forces gathered for battle. So Canaanites are coming from all over, even across on the coast there. They're going to come in. They're going to come up here. They're going to fight at Merom. The Israelite forces are going to come up from here and fight. And then basically the Israelites are going to start routing them up towards Sidon and over into this direction as well. I do want to look at the land division of Joshua. So basically, once you get to the Joshua 12, at the end of Joshua 12, when they finish the northern campaign, Joshua's going to divide the land up between the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's one of those sections that I do kind of skip over. He just lists a bunch of cities, you know, from this city to this city and this city, and they have this. And it's really hard without a map right in front of you to kind of know what's even being talked about. But I copied this from the ESV Bible Atlas because I thought this was helpful. When I get to this section of reading Joshua, I do like to look at the map again, just to remind myself where everybody is. But here's what they had to say. During the conquest of Canaan, Joshua allotted the land to the tribes of Israel. These boundaries, however, do not necessarily reflect the land each tribe actually inhabited by the end of the conquest. Several tribes, such as Dan, were unable to drive out the Canaanites that lived in much of their allotted territory. That's verse 1947, and we'll look at that in a moment. While other tribes controlled portions of land that were not originally allotted to them. So one of my questions on that worksheet I know is like, what are a couple of factors that we might want to consider when we're looking at land division? And these are my two factors, basically, that some tribes weren't able to fully conquer the land that they were allotted, and some tribes just lived, they mixed a little bit there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at these in an inverse way. We're going to look first at chapter 17, and then we'll look at chapter 19, just so I can illustrate this with the biblical passages. So within Issachar and Asher, Manasseh also had Bethshan, Ibleam, and the people of Dor, Endor, etc., etc., etc. So basically, if you look back at this map, you'll see Asher's right up here, and Issachar's here, and you've got Manasseh here, and East Manasseh here. So all that the book of Joshua is indicating is that the tribe of Manasseh actually did have some cities inside Issachar and Asher. Okay, so it's not like these boundary lines were always like hard and fast. And then if we go up to Joshua 19, I'm really just, this is just saying the seventh lot came out of Dan, here's all the cities. Then there's a parenthesis here in verse 47. When the territory of the Danites was lost to them, they went up and attacked Leshem, took it, put it to the sword, and occupied it. They settled in Leshem and named it Dan after their ancestor. So basically what you're getting here is, here's Dan's portion of the land. And what Joshua seems to be saying here is that they lost some of it. Maybe they initially had settled there, and then they lost it to some of the local tribes. We don't really know exactly because Joshua doesn't go into detail on that, but they did seem to lose it. And so what they do is they go all the way up here to Leshem, and they conquer that and name it Dan, and they live all the way up there, which is really far from their allotted area. Okay, we're on the home stretch here. Judges. The book of Judges, I'm not going to go into any detail on it. All I want to do is just show you this map to illustrate something super simple. I love Judges. It's super fun. I mean, it's really violent. It's really adult in a lot of ways, but it's just a really colorful book. It's really sad too, though. It's really disturbing and sad. But I enjoy the book of Judges just as kind of like a book to read. And what I wanted to illustrate here is that this map will show you in these white boxes the name of the judge, and in the green circle that will show you their area of influence. So for instance, if you get Jephthah, he's here on the Jabbok River and Mizpah there, and that's his area of influence. And what I want to illustrate here is just that the judges aren't centrally located, they are all over Israel. Okay? So not that that's like a huge point that you need to keep in your mind, but it just kind of illustrates that this time is, it's a time when everybody does what they want, right? And there's this cycle of sin and repentance and oppression and God rescuing them with these judges, but there's no real centralized government. Everything is just kind of like that. So here we go. I'm moving on to the next slide. I should have hit that sooner, but now we're stuck on Judges for another probably 2 seconds or so. Okay, what I'm going to do here with the united monarchy and the divided monarchy is just skip through these really fast, just to kind of illustrate a couple of things. Now, this is an area of Scripture, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. You can have a lot of fun with maps. I am really only going to scratch the surface on this. I'm not going to touch, like, Saul chasing David around. That's really fun to look at. I'm not going to touch the journey of the Ark of the Covenant, okay, when it kind of goes on a little bit of a journey. I'm not going to touch any of that stuff, but that's really fun. And I encourage you, if you just want to take a lot of the things that we're learning now, you can maybe borrow my Bible atlases, or Matthew has 1 or 2, I think. And you're welcome to, I think it'd be a really fun practice for you to look at those stories and chart where people are going. But we'll look at a couple of maps here. We'll look at the extent of Israel. So here's Saul's kingdom in gray. Here's David's kingdom in green. And here's Solomon's kingdom in light blue. Okay. So Saul's kingdom, you can see, is pretty small, but he does reach a lot of what we would consider modern Israel there. David really extends it, getting into the Philistines there, pushing it down to the Red Sea, a little bit further into the Transjordan, and all the way up into Syria, way up here. Solomon basically is able to maintain all of this, but he adds a super interesting part up here in the Hamath where he's able to get all the way up to the Euphrates River. So he doesn't really expand deeply into Mesopotamia, but is able to get into it a little bit, which is kind of impressive for that time in history. Okay. So now we're going to... All right. So basically, if you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll find that Saul, after his death, a bunch of people, they really don't like David. They're not into him, and they kind of rebel. They want to stick with Saul's son, Ishbosheth. And so Ishbosheth is able to take this northern part here, and David is able to take the southern part here. You can see where they located their capitals. We're not 100% sure about Menahem, but we think it might have been right here, and here's Hebron. Now David's going to move the capital as a part of him consolidating his power, but for right now, that's what the map looks like when he's kind of fighting in those first few chapters of 2nd Samuel. And now what we're going to look at is, well, okay, maybe I can get this here. Here's Jerusalem, Jebus. So it's a Jebusite city, and for David to take that city is kind of important politically because it's right on the border of the territory that he and Ishbosheth have. So it ends up being kind of important for him to take that. But how he takes it in 2 Samuel chapter 5 is kind of fun and interesting. You guys might remember from reading this that they are able to go through a water shaft and enter up into the city of Jerusalem. And it seems like archaeologically we have found that water shaft. Now, here's Hezekiah's tunnel, which I'm actually not going to end up talking about later on, although that's a really fun thing in its own right. I just don't have time to add that. But Jerusalem, as you can see, is set up on a hill. Okay? And down here below, this is on the eastern side of Jerusalem, you have the Kidron Valley. And you can enter, there's the Gihon Spring here, you can enter and you can go up this shaft. It's called Warren's Shaft because that's the guy who discovered it in modern times. And then there's this access tunnel that you can use to get to the surface entrance of the city. Based on this map and just kind of what I did, I wasn't sure about this blocked exit tunnel. I don't know if it was blocked during biblical times or if it's just blocked now. If anybody in the crowd knows, you can tell me. But I couldn't figure that out. But either way, whether they could enter through here or down here, they'd be able to kind of cut up into Jerusalem without having to deal with the walls. And as you can see here, the Jebusite city walls start here, and then Israelite city walls, they build them up a little bit higher, a little bit more fortified. Here are some pictures of that water shaft. These just look like holes. Not very exciting necessarily, but you can go there. My cousin Drew, he's actually a Western pastor in Michigan, he visited Israel once, I want to say a long time ago, like 20 years ago. But he got to go into Hezekiah's shaft and see Warren's, or Hezekiah's tunnel and see Warren's shaft here. But here's an overview of it. You can see here's the water tunnel, here's the spring, here's where Warren's shaft would be, so they could enter up in through that area and come out right about here. All right. Now I'm just waiting. We're really close to the end of this section. Here is the divided kingdom. Now, what I want to do is just make a couple of notes on this. So basically what happens is at the end of Solomon's reign, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, keeps Solomon's taxation practices, and a lot of people don't like that because they're being heavily taxed. And so Jeroboam, they kind of split up. So Solomon's other son, Jeroboam, comes up here in the north of Israel. A couple of things I just want to make note of. as they divide, we got a couple of things happening. I'm going to do this in the wrong order. But once divided, they lose some major areas. So as a divided kingdom, they lose power. The ability to hold on to Philistia, Ammon, Syria, etc., some of this, they're diminished in that sense. You'll note here that Moab and Edom, they got these striped lines. They're subject to Israel and subject to Judah, respectively. So what that means is they're vassal states. So as vassal states, what they do is they pay tribute. Okay, like Edom's going to pay tribute to Judah, and Moab's going to pay tribute to Israel. And that basically means that Israel and Judah are going to kind of leave them alone, more or less. And they're also going to give them protective services to some degree. So basically, this works out for these small kingdoms because they don't get harassed too much, and it works out for the big kingdoms because they get more money. All right? So that's what happens there. And then if you'll notice on this map, we've got two idols, okay, or two centers of worship that Jeroboam had set up. One here in Bethel, and one here up at Dan. So these mark the southern and northern boundaries of his territory. So Jeroboam turns to basically idolatrous worship. He turns away from Yahweh, and he becomes wicked in that respect. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight those is, first of all, they were on this map. But second of all, as I just press the button and we'll eventually get to it, we have archaeological evidence of these areas. And the one we're going to look at up here is in Dan. So this is Jeroboam's idolatry. I got this from BibleWalks.com. And these are some pictures of basically a worship center that we believe had been Jeroboam's up in that area in Dan. And so what you see is you've got, this is the sacrifice area. They've made kind of a replica with steel rods of what the altar would have looked like. The altar doesn't exist there anymore. But they just did that so people could have it for scale, see what it was. You can see there's little steps up here for the priest to kind of come up and do, sacrificey type things. Then back here, you've got a priest living quarters is what they think it is. Up here, you've got these wide steps that lead up to a platform, and this is where they think they would have had a golden calf. I think there's just one more slide in this half of my presentation. And it's just going to be another angle, but just to give you a sense of the scale of this. When I looked at this picture, there were a bunch of pictures that they had. Okay, when I first looked at this, I thought, just at my first sight, that this was like maybe like a, I don't know, 10-year-old girl or something like that. But later pictures revealed that this is an adult woman, and so these stairs are pretty large. This gives you a bigger sense of how large they were and just kind of the scale of the area. But that is all I have for this one. We need a break. I need a break. So yeah, that went over an hour. So what we'll do is we'll break for 10 minutes.